All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emily Bell, and I'm the communications coordinator of the Florida Wildflower Foundation. We're so glad you're here. Please feel free to hop in the chat box and let us know where you're joining us from today. Um, our webinar today is 10 Big Ideas Regarding Plants. For those of you not familiar with our organization, our mission is to protect, connect, and expand native wildflower habitats through education, research, planting, and conservation. Our work is made possible primarily through the sales and renewals of the Florida State license plate. That was our old look you saw previously, and the new plate on the road is here. These funds, along with donations and memberships, allow us to support and create projects that build awareness and knowledge of native plants throughout Florida. We'd like those of you who find our programs valuable to consider becoming a member, making a donation, or purchasing the State Wildflower Plate. And if you purchase or have the plate, you're eligible for a membership. So just let us know if you have the tag, and we will get you set up in the database. Also, be sure to check out our website for resources on planting and growing wildflowers, to learn where to see wildflowers in bloom, and for all of our upcoming events. We're also on social media, and you can find us on most platforms at FLA Wildflowers. Our next webinar will be continuing this series with Dr. Folsom as coming to terms with plant names on February 19th. Part 4, getting familiar with plant families, on April 16th. We'll take a little break in March and be back in May with botanical jargon, and wrap up in June with using keys to Florida plants. We've got some really exciting field trips coming up as well, so stay tuned there. Our next field trip will be to Haw Creek Preserve on Saturday, February 22nd, and you can join me for a lovely trip down their boardwalk to see some beautiful early blooming wildflowers. Also save the date for the Green Mountain Scenic Byway field trip to see their native demonstration garden provided with funds from our Viva Florida grant, as well as to tour the native plant restoration areas around Lake Apopka. Be sure to follow us on social media, subscribe to our newsletter, or check out flawildflowers.org/events to keep up with everything going on and register. A few quick housekeeping before we get started. All attendees are muted with cameras off. Please submit any questions via the Q&A feature at any point during the presentation, and they will be answered at the end of the presentation as time permits. If your question is not answered, you may email it to info@flawildflowers.org. Note that the chat is active and you're welcome to use it, but we do not monitor it for questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel in 24 to 48 hours. When it's available, you'll receive an email from us with a link to the recording, along with a resource page with additional links. And now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jim Folsom's lifelong love of plants is reflected in a BS in botany from Auburn University, an MA in biology from Vanderbilt University, and a PhD in research botany from the University of Texas at Austin. Though his research has centered largely on the orchid family, with much of that time spent in tropical America, including a year in Colombia on a Fulbright predoctoral fellowship, Jim's botanical interests are wide-ranging. For 35 years before his retirement in 2021, he was a curator and director of the botanical gardens at the Huntington in San Marino, California. And he dedicated much of his efforts there to educational programs that increase public interest and understanding of the science, culture, and history of plants and gardens. Topics reflected on his website, Botany in Context, as well as his TikTok channel at Botany in Context. He lives on St. George Island with his wife, Deborah, who's also a botanist, and they have 2 children, Molly and James. Jim currently serves as the incoming member for the board of the American Horticultural Society. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to Jim.
Okay.
So give us just a moment to switch over.
Am I there or not? I can't.
Yep, we've got you.
Okay, let's go back. Okay. Um, Nice to see you all again, or not see you, but at least talk with you. And today's talk is sort of a rehash of last month, but from a totally different perspective. I've had in my life some really great teachers, and each of those teachers was able to expand my thoughts about plants and allow me to understand that if you get your head around the big picture, it makes all of the detail a lot more meaningful, and it also makes it easier to understand and memorize it. So out of all of those experiences with those teachers, I've come up with this list of what I call 10 big ideas. And these are huge concepts that relate to all plants, but if you can get your head around them, it changes your perspective of the plants that you encounter. So I wanted to make it more meaningful for wildflowers. So I thought, well, how can I do that? Well, the way I did it is kind of silly. I'm presenting this lecture as a parade um, with a theme. So here we have a takeoff. I was judge at the Pasadena Rose Parade many years ago, and that was a delightful experience. And I'm thinking very sadly right now about all the friends we have in Pasadena area who've lost their homes. So this is kind of a bit of an homage to them and the Rose Parade. And what we're going to do is we're going to march through the 10 ideas, each being like a parade float and each being sponsored. So the first idea is that plants are alive. And that's kind of silly to even have to say it, but I've got some help from the warts, butterwort and bladderwort. These are we call it the Lentibulariaceae. They're herbs of wet places with these beautiful zygomorphic flowers and two anthers, and they have leaves like nobody else. These are the leaves of Utricularia inflata. Here's Utricularia, a different Floridana at the lake in Camel Lake, Liberty County. And the flower on the right is the yellow-flowered, not Pinguicula lutea. So let's go ahead. They are here to remind us that their motto is live free, because beauty surrounds you. And the message they want you to take in is that what it means to be alive. Okay, plant life is cellular, it's bounded. Life is a process. It's ongoing, it's organic, it's energized, it's iterative and self-perpetuating, and unfortunately, it's extinguishable. Life is changing. Living organisms grow, develop, metabolize, they reproduce, they disperse, they interact, and yes, they evolve. And life is totally dependent. It's dependent on the energy of the sun, and it's dependent on the raw materials present on this earth. And the great thing about plants is they are our intercessors. Plants take the raw materials of the earth and make them available to all other life forms. Now, looking down the road, we see idea number 2 floating up, and that's plants' cells are distinct and they are dedicated. And this is sponsored by the Lamiaceae. These plants are meant to be wonderful. They are plants with opposite leaves. They've got these great zygomorphic flowers. By zygomorphic, I mean bilaterally symmetrical, like you looking in a mirror. Okay, so they have these wonderful features, and they have schizocarps. A schizocarp is that strange little nutlet that all mints make, where the stigma goes, the style goes to the base, and then the carpels are little separate nutlets. And that's a character you associate with this family. They're here to tell you that though all life is cellular, plant cells are, in plant life, differ from animals and others. And what do we mean by different? Well, we mean that they have these cellulosic cell walls and this middle lamella that's like glue. And I want to make this small. I don't know how to do it. It sticks plants together. It sticks the cells together. So plant cells are fixed, and plants are fixed. They're sessile. They're somewhat rigid. and they control that through water pressure. They don't divide like animal cells. Animal cells pinch in. Plant cells divide by forming a plate where the cellulose deposits and then create two daughter cells. And plant cells are there to give structure, conduct water. They obtain and manage resources, and they protect the corpus like cork or all these fibers that keep the plant intact. Plants harbor these special plastids that aren't present in animal cells. The chloroplasts and their alter egos, the amyloplasts, the starch-containing plastids. And these, of course, make plants into light harvesting autotrophs, we call them. Auto meaning, and it's misspelled there, I see. Auto meaning that that they're self-feeding. They're therefore the primary producers, which means they're free to colonize like Krakatoa, a brand new habitat that shows up, and it can't go very far until there's something there that can produce food. Finally, plant cells do this strange thing. They create these meristematic cells that can generate tissues. And they remind us that plants are polar. The cells they produce for stems grow up generally, and the cells they produce for roots grow down generally and are very distinct. They create conductive and strengthening cells and tissues, which we call xylem and phloem. The epidermal cells of plants are very different, creating things like stomata that let carbon dioxide in and oxygen out and water vapor pass through. And plants create special cells like glands and lacticifers, these cells that create all the goos and the latexes and the alkaloids, the terpenoids, the phenolics that we sometimes value in plants and sometimes find poisonous. Now, the third idea that we'd like to float by you is that the chain of life is unbroken. And I've chosen the Asteraceae as the newest, the biggest, and the brightest plant family. And you will know them because they are a world of capituli and cypsellas. We will talk about that in 2 months when we talk about plant families. But basically, those two words belong to this family. Now, not to brag, but you can learn a lot of things from the flowers if you've ever watched Alice in Wonderland on TV. And you can learn that along with monarchs, I've got this thing is in my way, I can't see anything. Along with monarchs and humans, plants share the same basic cellular construction, the same genetic codes. We all use glucose as our primary form of exchange of energy and carbohydrates. We all have oxygen-based respiration, and we all have the same common ancestor. Yes, 3 billion years ago, but the same common ancestor. So your cousin, 1,000,000 times removed, is a sunflower. Cellular life is an absolute miracle. It's persisted over billions of years. It's based on these commonalities we've discussed: cell structure, genetic codes, respiration, glucose. Scientists are confident that all life forms use the same ingredients and the same pathways and the same instructions. That life threads itself from each of us currently alive. Each organism currently alive threads its ancestry back to some point at which they were all shared. And of course, that baked into that is the idea that life never ends. I mean, it does end, but when it does, it's gone. Life that you have is the continuation of life that every ancestor you could imagine ever had, because it never died to the point that you exist and that sunflower exists, that Phabanthus. Life has existed for over 3 billion years. The motto of this family is omnis cellula e cellula, which translates as cells only come from cells. Life only comes from life. It is very precious. And it's kind of curious. It's the one point of agreement, I think, or a singular point of agreement between contemporary traditional religion and contemporary science. That is, both of these will tell you that there is a tree of life, and both of these will tell you that life is everlasting, that the life we experience today is life that has persisted for billions of years. Now, looking at the next idea, plants mine the earth. I selected the Sarracenias for this because they're out looking for nitrogen all the time. This is a colony of Sarracenia flava, one of the ones with the reddish color to the leaves. They're here to remind us that plant life is elementary. It's carbon-based, and that's despite all that science fiction that wants you to believe that you can get a silicon-based carbon life, a silicon-based life. Life over the past 2.5 centuries of study, scholars have identified at least 19 elements that are crucial to life. So let's look at what we think of elements today. So here is a contemporary periodic table. I have edited it to show only the elements that are important to plants. So 19 elements plus 3 oddballs that aren't really important to plants, but sometimes show up. So these are the 19 elements that plants need. We covered this last month, and I gave you a mnemonic, which I'm gonna put back up for you. C. Hopkins Cafe, okay, managed by my cousin Moselle, and we'll look at this again. So from air and water, we get CHO, and from earth, we get these principal ones, phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen, and all the rest. And we can look at it in a different way. C. Hopkins Cafe, managed by my cynical cousin Mona. And this is, by the way, you don't have to read all this now. It's too little to read. But I have posted this entire slideshow with commentary. And I think Emily and Rose, they've made it available for you so you can link to it through the website. But in this slide, I've shown you a little bit about what these different compounds do. Of course, carbon is the basis for the organic skeleton to all life. And then hydrogen and oxygen, which come from the atmosphere and from water. And then as you go down, so you can see what these all do, and I've actually annotated that more in the notes in the slideshow that's published. And here I've color-coded it. So the first 3, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, are the most predominant element in any living cell. The next 3 for plants are the hardest to get. They're the ones that leach from soil the easiest. They're highly mobile. And so these are the 3 that show up in commercial fertilizers, like we call it the NPK ratio. So when you buy a commercial fertilizer with 3 numbers on it, those numbers represent how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is available for a plant in that fertilizer. And then the rest, let's just look at what that means. 96% carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen make up 96% of the weight of a plant. If you dry a plant and break it into elements, 96% of that weight is due to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The next big one is nitrogen. It's really important because nitrogen is present in every amino acid, and it's present in the bases, the DNA bases. All the rest make up a very small sliver, but they're important nonetheless. So in summary, life is carbon-based. There are 19 elements crucial to plant life. You can remember those through that mnemonic. Most of the bulk, the mass of a plant, is hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen. And plants build themselves, making their own carbohydrates, their own proteins, their own vitamins. You should not spend money paying for expensive plant vitamins because there's no such thing. Plants make their own. Okay, number 5, the next idea, it's just not easy being green. This is sponsored by the iris and the violet family. And the reason for that is going to be apparent in a second. They own the rainbow, and they're here to share its secrets. So the first secret is the secret that relates them to owning the rainbow. So Isaac Newton in 1666 is the first person to explain that you can take a prism and you can break white light into the rainbow, into the spectrum. Well, the Latin word for rainbow is iris. So the iris family is named for the rainbow. But more than that, he loved violets, and he chose to add a color to the spectrum. So before Newton published his optics, there were only 6 colors in the rainbow. He added the 7th because I think he was charmed by the fact that green is in the middle, and there are 3 warm colors, red, orange, yellow, and there are 3 cool colors, blue, indigo, and violet. So that's why I say that the irises and the violets own the rainbow. The second reason is really different, and that is plants are green because they use less green light. And this is something that's kind of uh, difficult to get your head around sometimes. But the reason the world is green is because those plants are using the photosynthesis. Chlorophyll is using more red and blue light than it is green. Let's go back and look at from the last lecture, last presentation, photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, water, the energy from sunlight, you get glucose, oxygen, and water back. Now, that's untidy. More realistically, it's 2 reactions. The light reactions, you split water to get oxygen and high energy electrons, and then separately, you combine carbon dioxide with water and you get sugars. Now, you're not just using pure sunlight to do this. That's the trick. If you look at a chart, I hate to bring up charts because they're so confusing. If you look at a chart, and so this is wavelength of light across the bottom, from radio waves down to ultraviolet, okay? And here's within that huge spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, this is the rainbow. It's only from right in here to right about there. That's what we can see. That's what's visible. Plants also function in that same rainbow. Basically, this is the part of the electromagnetic spectrum that can impact organic molecules without destroying them. So the rainbow is what we can see. It's also where plants get their energy, and they use mostly blue light and red light. They use some green, but this light, which strikes the earth, this is left over. So the light that we can see is green by greater proportion because plants are pulling out much of the red and blue. So that's now, so the visible spectrum, the rainbow, is biochemically the active part of the spectrum. What we can see is what plants can use, because anything with a longer, less energetic wavelength is just heat or radio wave. Anything shorter is like UV. It's destructive. We put on sun coating to keep from getting sunburned from UV rays out in full sunlight. Now, let's look at it a different way. Of the energy striking the earth, 50% is not absorbed by plants and dealt with in any way. Of the other 50%, 15% is reflected or transmitted, and it's mostly green. Okay, 10% is lost. They call it loss, but it's not so lost because plants also need to be warm sometimes. So this is heat dispensation within the plant. 20% of that light energy is needed to go through the process of capturing energy and turning it into carbohydrates. And 5% is stored as sugars. So that's the product. And that seems so inefficient, but I added up differently. if you were the CFO of a corporation, you would claim that 35% of the reflected, let's see, the heat, the metabolism, and the product, you would claim that as gross profit. And then you would say, this year we got a 5% profit. I think that's pretty good. A lot of companies don't operate at that level. So plants operate at a 5% profit. Now, the light that we just talked about is full sunlight. That's not the only kind of light plants encounter. If a plant is in full sun, this is the spectrum of light that it sees across the rainbow. But the plants in the understory are receiving plant light that has already been filtered by the leaves above. So if you're an understory plant, you are evolved to deal with a totally different quality of light. And that's kind of fascinating. So the plants in the understory that are native to the understory might not do as well in the sun because they've evolved to deal with the fact that the light of the understory has a totally different quality. That means that it's not just sunlight photosynthesis. It is the quality of the light. And then there are two other big issues with light in plants. And that is, for the last 30 years, we've understood that plants actually take cues from blue light that affect how they grow when the stomata open. And we've known for almost 100 years that day length is important to how plants grow. This is a photo of the famous Maryland mammoth tobacco plant. It's a plant that was being studied as part of the work at the USDA in Maryland. And they could never get it to flower. And they were trying to understand what stimulated flowering in tobacco. And then they kept one in the greenhouse. And given the fact that it was protected, it grew and grew and grew. But finally, because of changes in day length, the thing flowered. And that was the breakthrough that allowed us to understand that photoperiod has a lot to do with flowering. And that photoperiod is all based on far red light. So blue light perceived by plants can impact some ways plants grow. Far red and red light can infect other ways. So plant growth is truly responsive to all aspects of light. Now, let's go to point 6, idea 6. Water is the medium of life. Our sponsor for this is the Pontederiaceae. We are a family of heterostylous aquatic monocots, one of which is problematic. So the non-native water hyacinth is in this family, but Pontederia is quite controlled and quite beautiful. It's a very handsome plant. And the motto is stay hydrated. We bring forth this incredible picture, illustration. So water is a liquid like no other. It's the only liquid that pretty much can coat the mantle of the earth. And it's got this strange solid phase where the ice floats in its own water liquid. It's a tiny polar molecule that can cling to itself and cling to other molecules through what's called hydrogen bonding. Okay. Thus, it's a universal solvent. In addition to that, it has incredible surface tension. You know how water beads up. That shows how strong the surface tension is. And it's got tensile strength. If it weren't for the tensile strength, you would not be able to pull a vacuum and siphon water. It also has significant latent heat. When you try to bring water to a boil, there's a period where you have to pump a lot of heat into it to get it to the point at which it will start to boil and vaporize. And when it does vaporize, it takes a lot of heat to cause those surface molecules to turn into the gaseous phase. So water is a remarkable small molecule. But what's incredible is for the fact that it coats Earth, that it's ever present. If you took all the water that we know of in the planet, the water in the crust, the water in the oceans, in the glaciers, and in all the streams and rivers, and in all of the plants and animals, it would create a sphere hovering over Kansas. And you can read the dimensions here later. So that represents the entire volume of water that is present on the face of the planet. This tiny sphere hovering over Tennessee and Kentucky is the volume of fresh water, which is water available to most land plants and animals. So for all of its ubiquitousness, water is incredibly precious. Now, water is life for plants. It's the medium of the cell. It's the way plants stay turgid and stay crisp. It's how plants transport nutrients. It can even be a conduit for electrical impulses. It buffers a plant against temperature changes because it's got that high heat of latency. And it cools plants through transpiration. So when water transpires out of a plant, it's not just loss, it's keeping the plant cool. And for most plants, or many plants, it's the most limiting resource in the habitat. Water is also death. Physically destructive if it is frozen, if the cell freezes or the water ices before the plant has been able to change its membranes to deal with that. It's smothering if oxygen is required. For example, in the roots of some plants that are not adapted to wetland conditions. It can lead to plasmolysis. If it's too much is lost, the cell loses water, it loses turgor, and it dies. So in Florida, we are blessed by an abundance of water, but it means that this habitat is different from so many others. It means that our ever-present deep sands are both drought prone and nutrient deficient. It means that we have a lot of plants adapted to waterlogged soils. It means that our calcareous layers weather very quickly. We get all these wonderful karst lakes. It means here along the coast that habitat changes can be very abrupt based on where the water table hangs out. And you can just a rise of 4 feet and you've got a totally different habitat. It also means this is prime conditions for escaped non-natives, because probably the ruling condition, the governing condition for invasive plants in a habitat is the presence of water. So Florida is prime territory. And you can look at that. Of our 5,000 species flora, 1,500 species are non-native. So finally, we just say plants process and require more water than other life forms. So water transpires through the stomata of a leaf at a rate of 400 molecules of water for each molecule of carbon dioxide that enters. So in addition to the fact that, it's important that water is cooling as it transpires, but since there's no mechanism going out and particularly grabbing carbon dioxide and bringing it in, it's all pure diffusion, then when a stomate opens for carbon dioxide to come in, for each one molecule of carbon dioxide, you're going to lose 400 of water. So it's a crucial interface, and it means plants use a lot more water than animals. It's a one-way flow. Plants will not get nutrients to the leaves if water is not lost from the leaves. Plants will not stand upright, and the cells will not grow properly if water is deficient. And of course, water is involved in so many steps in photosynthesis. So water is truly important to plants. Let's move to point number 7. Plants alternate realities. This is brought to you by the Gentianaceae. And I chose them because they're rotate. I love this flower. And there's the stigma before it opens up. So this Sabbatia, this one has 12 petals. And it invites us to circle back and look at plant life cycles. Back in Shakespeare's time, people thought ferns were magical. And they thought they were magical because they never saw them flower. And there was this folklorical thing that if you had fern seed, then you had the power of invisibility, since fern seed were invisible, right? So, of course, we know now that that's not the truth. Ferns are not flowering plants. They make spores. And when they make a spore, that spore is the first cell in what we call the haploid generation. So the fern itself, every cell has two complements, two sets of chromosomes. Once reproductive division takes place, we call it meiosis, then the spore only has one set of chromosomes. And that spore in a fern and in a moss, but in a fern, it actually lands on the ground, germinates into a little flap of green tissue, which we call a gametophyte. And we call it a gametophyte because that little flap of tissue makes the gametes, the male and female gametes, that will come back together at fertilization to make the zygote. So understanding that as a visible sample of what we call alternation of generations, it doesn't take much genius to look at a life cycle of a flowering plant and realize that it's the exact same thing. I've outlined the gametophyte generation with these orange dashes for you, but the pollen grain is formed from that spore, that microspore. Each microspore is the first of a haploid cell in the generation. And so that orange should actually come out and grab this. But this is the gametophyte generation, the male gametophyte. Down in the ovule, the same thing is happening. A megaspore is the first cell in the haploid life of that female plant. It makes an egg sac, it creates an egg, and then with fertilization, we're back to the sporophyte generation. So the sporophyte generation is called that because it makes the spore. The gametophyte generation is called that because it makes the gametes. And when the gametes unite, you get the zygote, the first cell in the new life, and that zygote gives rise to the plant. This is not, I've come up with a new way of outlining that for you. But just in summary, each plant generates spores. A spore is haploid. It's alive. You've got to remember that. Through a few cell divisions, the spore gives rise to an egg or a sperm. They are living cells. The pollen grain is a gametophyte. The egg sac's a gametophyte. And then we go to the next phase. And so I've taken our sebacea and I've decided that the style and stigma point to fertilization, and fertilization gives rise to the sporophyte generation, which is all of these phases: the zygote, seed, embryo, germination, growth, flower. And in the flower, we get the spores, and that is the gametophyte generation, which starting with the spore, pollination, gametes, and fertilization. So I've decided that the sebacea is now the symbol for plant life cycles. Number 8, quickly, plants are rooted. And I brought into the conversation my favorite native orchids, platantheras, to remind you that these plants are stuck in place. They can only move at 2 points in their life cycle. So here is Platanthera chapmanii, and I'm holding in my hand a single flower. That's the column. That little sticky pad is the visidium. We'll look at that in a second. This is the spur that comes out of the lip. Okay, here you can look at it a little bit differently, and the stigma is up in there. Now, the pollen is produced, it's called a pollinium, and there are 2 of them, one in each anther sac, and that sticky disc will stick to, in this case, a pine needle, but in nature, the proboscis of a visiting butterfly. And so this is the Palamedes butterfly visiting a plant. This is from an old slide, so the color's not quite good, but it's from 1975 when I was here studying these plants, and the pollen sticks to the proboscis of the insect. The fallout is that in late July and August, this happens, and then 3 months later, we have capsules and the seed being dispersed. So the life cycle of all flowering plants is kind of baked into this. There's a stage at which pollen moves. That's dispersal because you're moving genes from one plant to another. And then there's a stage at which seed moves. That's seed dispersal. In the case of plants, there's usually a vector, either an insect or the wind or something, a pollen vector. For seed, the same is true. There can be a vector, an animal, the wind, water. And in some cases with seed, actually explosive ballistic. The plant can project and send them out, gravity being the main dispersal agent. So plants are rooted, but they do get around. Number 9, plants know their ups and downs, and I've chosen the grasses. Plants are polar. A plant knows what's up and it knows what's down. It operates through growing shoots, apical meristems, the shoot apical meristem and the root apical meristem. We call them Sam and Ram. But those are not the only meristems. They can develop new ones through a process called totipotency. And the growth is controlled by environmental cues and hormones. So there's a codicil here. Plants only make roots, stems, and leaves. So we'll go back and look at the slide we saw earlier, which is a germinating radish, and the root's going to go down, the shoot's going to go up. A germinating bean, the root's going to go down, the shoot's going to go up, and it's only going to make growing tips and stems and leaves, and the roots only make roots. And the same is true of the monocots. But there are exceptions. Stems, typically upright, they can be horizontal, like stolons. They can be burrowing. They can be twining and clasping. Roots, typically growing down, can be adventitious. This is really common among monocots that make adventitious roots beautifully and quickly and easily. They can be free growing in all directions, like in epiphytes. They can turn upward. The pneumatophores of taxodium are considered roots. They can be plundering, like parasites and hemiparasites. So the Agellinus, the roots of Agellinus actually tap into the roots of neighboring plants. Leaves, typically blade-like, can form bracts that make the outer coating of buds, the fascicles of like a pine needle, spathes of aroids, whatever. Anything that's attached to a stem in a plant is some kind of a leaf. They take on specialized roles. The leaf tip can become a tendril. In the Sarracenias, they make traps. You've looked at the utricularias where they make these special traps, and then you looked at the pinguiculas when the leaf has that sticky butter-like consistency. They can gather water, as in the tillandsias, where the scales actually take in the water and nutrients. And most importantly, leaves develop as petals, anthers, and carpels. We interpret the parts of a flower to be specialized leaves. And one of the reasons we do that is because we know that ferns produce spores. So there's such a thing as a vegetative leaf and a fertile leaf. And anthers and carpels are fertile leaves. So that brings us to our last point. Plants have performance issues. Let's face it, we all do. And I've chosen to represent this, to sponsor this floated idea, Bromeliaceae, which is the world of free spirits. These are grasses. They're in the grass order, but they're different. They're New World grasses with an inferiority complex because the bromeliads are limited to the New World in origin, and they're the only plants in the grass order with inferior ovaries. Everybody else, the caryxes, the juncus, have superior ovaries. And they're here to remind you of nature and nurture. Each generation begins as a single cell. I think of the cell as the dowry and the nucleus as the genotype or software, because the cell is given by the plant as a construction that the plant constantly recreates, going back billions of years, right? And the genotype is there like software, like instructions, okay? But just as with your children, there's nature and there's nurture. In addition to everything, all the instructions, all the plans, all the investment, the new generation is out in the world and has to deal with an environment that may be different from what the parents dealt with. And so suddenly you have instructions that are perfect and an outcome that's not. We call that nurture. In the plant world, we say that's the phenotype. What is in the instructions give and the dowry give is not the last story. The last story is what happens in the interaction with the environment. And there's a range of things that can happen. And we term that phenotypic plasticity. Okay, so last year, I went out in the Boxar and I collected from one Cyrilla, I collected several leaves. And from one Cliftonia, I collected several leaves. From one Clethra and from one Itea. And I was kind of interested in the fact that these are all shrubs that are that have white flowers. And sometimes at a glance, you just wonder what separates them. Well, of course, you find out they're very distinct. But these are different leaves from one branch of a tai. These are different leaves from one branch of a Cliftonia, Clethra, and Itea. So even within an individual plant, you can't get two leaves to look exactly alike. The recent study published back in 2020 by two researchers at the University of Florida, Drew Hyatt and Luke Flory, they were concerned with Imparatta and the spread of that grass throughout Florida. And they wanted to compare the performance of Imparatta in sun and shade with plants that are often associated with where Imparatta succeeds. So Andropogon, Eragrostis, Sargastrum, and also Elephantippus, Coreopsis, and Helianthus. And so what they did was they grew the plants in sun and in shade. And so here are the natives, and these are the Elephantippus. I mean, not Eragrostis. I'm sorry. They don't have the picture of the Elephantippus. This is the Helianthus angustifolius, and this is the Coreopsis floridanus. And these are samples of plants grown in sun and in shade, sun and shade, sun and shade. And it just reminds us that a simple change in habitat will elicit a totally different appearance and growth habit to the plant. And we call that phenotypic plasticity. Okay. And I think that'll get us through the summary. The big idea is plants are alive. Cells are distinct and dedicated. The chain of life is unbroken. Back 3 billion years, plants mine the earth. They are the interceder between us and a raw earth. It's not easy being green, but it's easy for us because plants do all the work. Water is the medium of life. Plants alternate realities. Plants are rooted. They know their ups and downs, but yes, plants have performance issues. Okay, I am going to turn it back to you guys.
Great, thank you. That was, again, another fantastic presentation. I don't know about our attendees, but I think a new, totally favorite personal quote of mine is going to be, "Your cousin a million times removed is a sunflower." I absolutely love that perspective. We don't have any questions right now. I'll give folks a moment to pop some in if they come up. I know with topics like this, it's so dense and we want to digest it.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yeah. That's not a bad at all. It's just, I think it tends to, our questions come up later. So I am going to share the link now that Jim mentioned earlier for today's presentation. I'm going to pop that in the chat. And then, as I mentioned, though, you will also receive this link with the email when the recording is ready. and it'll be posted on the post with the recording. So you'll be able to find it in multiple ways. Yeah, but again, just absolutely fantastic, Jim. Thank you so much for sharing. We can't wait to see you again next month. And thanks again for everybody who hopped on today. We're always excited to spend an afternoon with you, and we hope we'll see you again
Okay.
next month,
We'll see you guys on the 19th of January. Okay.
February.
Well, we got January to do yet. No, this is January. Sorry, you're right. February. We'll be in February. I'm so mixed up because 2 days later we get on a cruise ship and go to the Panama Canal back and forth. So we'll be gone for 30 days. That's why there's no March lecture.
Yeah,
So
that's gonna be
yeah,
interesting.
yeah. But I'll be broadcasting from California. I'll be at the Huntington.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, great.
So I'll be joining you from there.
All right.
Okay.
We'll see you
Thanks
then.
very much. Thanks for your help.
Bye, everybody.